Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 7th Annual Bay Area Book Festival. I'm Brooke Warner, board chair of the festival, and I am delighted to introduce this evening's event. Tonight's program is entitled Epicenter of Girlhood, Carol Edgarian and Vendela Vida on Coming of Age in San Francisco. We are thrilled to have Carol Edgarian with us this evening. Carol's novels include the newly released Vera, the New York Times bestseller, 3 Stages of Amazement, and the international bestseller, Rise the Euphrates, winner of the ANC Freedom Prize. Her articles and essays have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, NPR, and W, among other outlets, and she is the co-founder of Narrative Magazine, a leading digital publisher of fiction, poetry, and art, and of Narrative in the Schools, which provides free libraries and writing resources for teachers and students around the world. Vendela Vida was supposed to be our second guest, but we have a late breaking announcement. Unfortunately, she was rushed to the hospital a few days ago to have her appendix taken out, and she's not quite ready to be with us tonight. That said, a couple of months ago, right when her new novel, We Run the Tides, came out, the festival presented an interview with Vendela and her husband, Dave Eggers, as part of a major international event with 12 countries around the world. Vendela addressed some of the very questions we were going to pose to her tonight. So at the last minute today, we were able to select some of that footage to share with you. Vendela has published several novels before We Run the Tides, including The Diver's Clothes Lie Empty and Let the Northern Lights Erase Your Name. She was the founding editor of The Believer magazine and has written a number of screenplays. If you want to express your wishes to Vendela in the chat, please do, and we'll send her the transcript. And she's very, very sorry to miss out being with us tonight in person. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by Cherilyn Parsons. Cherilyn is the founder and executive director of the Bay Area Book Festival, which has become one of the most prominent and international literary festivals in the US since launching in 2015. She also created Women Lit, which elevates women's voices through events featuring notable female authors and nurtures literary community among women. A special hello to all the Women Lit members who have joined us for this evening's talk. We're really happy that you're here. Previously, Cherilyn helped build the field of nonprofit journalism, notably at the Center for Investigative Reporting. I'm super excited to hand things over to Cherilyn and to hear from Carol about coming of age in San Francisco, her gorgeous new novel, Vera, about the 1906 earthquake that decimated the city, and so much more. Have fun, you two.
Thank you. Well, Carol, it's so fun to talk with you.
Hey, you. Hello.
Yeah, I mean, kind of face to face.
Kind of face to face.
Better than a phone call. That's right. Yeah. Well, just sending all of our wishes just right off the bat. I mean, Vendela will be watching this program, if not now, then a little bit later. And like Brooke said, we have some fantastic footage of her talking expressly about this book, and it was some of the same questions we were going to go over. So it's like Vendela via video again. So, but she's certainly here in spirit.
Well, and wishes from all of us that for a speedy recovery, and let's have her in this room as much as possible tonight. I just loved this book, and so I'm eager to talk about it. So yeah. We'll talk about it.
Yes. Well, let's jump into that then, talking about both of your novels. Both are very voice driven. The sort of the vibe, the feeling, the language of the main character really drives the novels. And I guess maybe we'll start with, I'll give a quick overview of Vera, and you can tell me what I didn't include, and then maybe you can read just the first couple paragraphs to just kind of catch that voice. So, all right. So I would say that Vera is really an adventure story, kind of a coming of age story of a teenage girl, very hilarious, street savvy, 15-year-old girl in 1906, San Francisco, right at the time of the great earthquake. And I know you told me Jennifer Egan called it a total romp. And that was the feeling I had too, of just pleasure as I was reading it. So Vera is the illegitimate daughter of the city's most famous Madam, Rose. who has hidden the fact that she had a child by placing her in the child, Vera, in a home with a Swedish woman and her daughter, who's 18 years old. And when the quake happens and everything falls apart, Vera sort of goes on a journey to sort of survive, and then also to try to find Rose, who would have been in a location that was totally buried by the earthquake. But it's ultimately about finding her own power, not so much just finding Rose, but finding herself and discovering her smarts and kind of playing the politics, the dynamics of the leadership of the time. So that's a kind of a poor facsimile maybe of the story. What have I not gotten, or maybe just telling the voice? Yeah, tell us a little bit more about it.
Well, I think there's so much these two books have in common, but in terms of Vera, so much crisis, whatever that crisis is, that is the defining crisis of one's life, or certainly one's adolescence. Mm-hmm. Both these books use that as a springboard to for these characters to find some kind of agency. And in Vera, there was the quake, but there's a line in the book, I'd been waiting all my life for a disaster greater than my birth. And so the quake, while the quake takes many things away from her and puts her into really survival mode, it also gives her the freedom a freedom that in 1906 women just didn't have, particularly young women, to live the life she wants to live and to find her real people and to find her moral compass. And I think both these books talk a lot about that, about betrayals and finding one's truth and having to stick by one's truth, even when it's not popular or even apparent, So why don't I read a little bit and then we can dive
and show everyone this gorgeous cover too. It's just spectacular. I don't know if it's glittering too much in the light, but it's just spectacular. So
thank you. So I'm just going to read the first two paragraphs. How's that? First things. I always thought of my city as a woman, but the house, it turned out, was a woman too. When the quake hit, she groaned. Her timbers strained to hold on to their pins, the pins snapping, and the rocks beneath the house, they had voices too. And if ever I wondered how long it would take for the world to end, I know, 45 seconds. An unearthly stillness preceded and followed the shaking. It's what we did and didn't do in the stillness that determined the rest of our days.
Terrific. Do you want to jump to the very last sentence? We talked about that earlier, of that fantastic
last sentence of the opening.
Yeah, it's great.
Let's see. Well, it talks about Rose of the Rose, who is her real mother, who's the madam. She did not raise me. That duty fell to a Swedish widow employed to bring me up to be, I suppose, anything but a hooker. In that, Maury Johnson was successful. I am not a hooker. I am only a thief.
Great
line. Really, this is really a book about thieves. Everybody in the book is a thief. And of one sort or another, they steal things, they steal secrets, they steal love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you, let's just jump to Vendela's book. Just to
I'd love to.
Yeah, of each of the
I love this cover.
It's a beautiful cover. Yeah. How about if you describe this one briefly, and then I'll read a few lines from her book to capture the feelings. Does that work?
Yeah. Wow, there's so much I want to say about it. Teenage girls in the 80s run amok in Seacliff, this fair city of Seacliff is its own pocket, and they go to a fictional all-girls school, Sprague, and they run Seacliff. And one day they witness something. That did it happen? It might have happened. And the discrepancy between opinions between Eulaby and her best friend, Maria Fabiola, one of the great names in literature. Fabiola, is it fabrication? Is it fabulous? It's all of the above. They are the leaders, and this event that they witness, they have a difference of opinion. And from that, the world turns, and Eulaby is ostracized, and things evolve from there. And it is a wickedly funny, incredibly smart thriller of a tale of what happens, and how desire, young women's desire, young women's sexuality, young women's yearning to be seen, all of that comes into play in such a deft way. Just a beautiful, beautiful book.
Both of your books were ones that I just wanted to get to, like, every night, you know, and you find a novel and it takes a while sometimes to like land on a novel that you're like, you love. And then when, of course, it's over, you're so sad because this is void in your life. But both of your novels were ones that, like, yes, you know, I'm going to be completely in the world of this book. And I'll just start reading from the very beginning of Vendela's book, We Run the Tides. And what struck me immediately about this novel was the voice. There's repetition, and there's rhythm, and there's these idioms of these of the teenage girl and the time, you know, the 90s. So I'm going to read just a few sentences, and then I'll jump a little bit to a few other sentences just to give you all a quick sense. So it starts out, we are 13, almost 14, and these streets of Seacliff are ours. We walk these streets to our school perched high over the Pacific, and we run these streets to the beaches, which are cold, windswept, full of fishermen and freaks. We know these wide streets and how they slope, how they curve toward the shore, and we know their houses. We know the towering brick house where the magician Carter the Great lived. He had a theater inside, and his dining room table rose up through a trap door. We know that Phil Cantor from Jefferson Starship lived, or maybe still does live, in the house with a long swing that hangs over the ocean. And then she goes on with the people that they know on the street. They're sort of doing this, you know, teenage girl tour. And the voice is always we. We know this, we see that. And this is kind of like young girl swagger and insecurity at the same time. And then she gets to she says, when I say we, when I say we, I sometimes mean the four of us Seacliff girls who are in the 8th grade at the Sprague School of Girls. But when I say we, I always mean Maria Fabiola and me.
Right.
And Maria Fabiola.
That's what's so fabulous about it, because this collective we, which is so it's so gripping from day one, because the collective we knows everything, right? The collective we in you know, that idea of a girl pack is so incredible and so important when you're in middle school, right? But then, of course, it's also the underside of it is the vulnerability, because the pack breaks and everything you knew to be true and solid is gone. So it's just beautiful.
And that's what Eulaby has to do, without spoiling, you know, to grow up. Could we run the first clip? And this is Vendela Vida in a conversation that was part of this Literature Live Around the World program that the Bay Area Book Festival was part of. We were the U.S. festival, and Dave and Vendela were interviewed by Daniel Gumbiner, who is the managing editor of The Believer. And so if you see Dave and someone else in there and Daniel in there, that's, you know, who they are. But let's hear Vendela talking about the book.
I actually started this book the day after Trump won the election in 2016, and it started as a nonfiction book about lying. And I was really obsessed after the election with the work of a Swedish-American philosopher, Sissela Bach, who is probably familiar to people in Norway especially, but she talks a lot about the pollution of writing and pollution of lying, not pollution of writing, pollution of lying, and how one lie can actually create other lies. And so I wrote this book as a nonfiction book for about a year, and then it turned into a fictional, I decided to turn it into fiction. And I thought, who better to embody the practice of lying than teenage girls, because I think by their very nature, they are shapeshifters and they are liars. And I think it's part of trying on new identities. I think that's part of being a teenage girl. And the trick is to actually, eventually change and stop lying to yourself and others. And that's my definition of being a grown-up, is actually when you stop lying. Some people say you're a grown-up when you make your own dental appointments, but I don't think, for me, it's when you stop lying. The inciting incident in the book is the girls are walking to school one day and they see a man in a car, and he does something horrendous. He does something, I won't say what he does, but he does something that 3 of the girls claim to see, and one girl, the protagonist, Eulaby, does not see. And she does not support, she thinks that her friends are lying, and she does not support their lie. And as a result, she's ostracized from the friend group for not going along with their lie. So that was how Trump inspired this novel.
Thank you. And Trump, I believe, played a role in inspiring Vera.
Oh, that's wild. I didn't know that's where it began for Vendela. Similarly, it was pre the 2016 election, and I was feeling very much that our society was in a precarious state. And I really started thinking about a moment when society would really fall, that all the structure that we thought was there and invaluable collapsed. And so I started to go back. I had a certain obsession with the 1906 Quake, but didn't think I was going to write about it. And all of a sudden, it seemed like the perfect place to talk about society, because also what was happening in 1906 was this great town of ours, of San Francisco, was just corrupt down to its very bones. Literally, the bones of City Hall were made not with marble but paper mache, and the mayor of the town, a fellow named Eugene Schmitz, was going to be indicted on the morning of the quake. And instead, he got a disaster that postponed his fate. But that was really what drew me back to 1906, which just goes to show things have changed and they haven't changed.
Mm-hmm. Now, you called Vera a thief. And in We Run the Tides, there is some decisions around sort of choosing one's moral compass. And you talk about San Francisco being a place of a lot of corruption.
Right.
And tell us about the name Vera. I think this has some relevance here too.
Well, Vera means truth, and it means truth in almost every language. There's Vera. And I wanted a name. She has her mothers, and they're of different ethnicities, and so a name that would work in both their languages, but also her quest is to find what is true in this corrupt society, in this world where she doesn't really belong to anyone or anything. She has a mother. Her real mother will only see her a few times a year, and her foster mother is both a drunk and someone who's in debt who looks to Vera to save her. So Vera's looking for what is true, and it is, and both books, so much of what We Run the Tides is talking about is this sense of lying. And the other side, of course, of lying is having to own what you think is true, even if it damns you, And I loved what she said about that, about when you're an adult, you have to make your own dentist appointments, and when you're an adult, you stop lying. Well, of course, for both of us, where we began this book, there were lots of adults who were lying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so you set your character, Vera, on this journey of growing up in this hugely tumultuous time. How did you sort of just chart through the decisions, the things that were happening? I mean, how did you end up, because there's all these twists and turns, how did you sort of lay out her journey personally, you know, obviously emotionally, but just in terms of the issues you wanted to explore? You know, again, you talked about sort of the moral compass and the relevance to today.
Well, I think, you know, when you're doing a book that's historical, you know, there's all the research that goes into it. So there are all those, I mean, you know, when I'm researching something like this, I'm looking for all those opportunities that I can exploit and take a little kernel that's true and blow it up and make it something that that moves the drama forward. So I really wanted to write an adventure story. Something you and I've talked about this notion, and I love the quickness of We Run the Tides. I mean, what you said about looking forward to reading it every night, that feeling of it's a fictional landscape that you're totally immersed in, and then those are the books that really have captured me through time, and that if I do my job right, I hope Vera feels that way.
You did. You did. That's
good.
Exactly how I would describe your book. And then. And it was also funny too.
Good.
You know? So
you know,
we'll talk more about the humor.
Well, you know, I mean, I'm fascinated by these sort of boxes, and this is a lot of what the book is about people are put in boxes, you know, to define something, you always have to leave something out, right? And I think sometimes when we say historical fiction, it sounds like it's got the kind of dire undertone of Jane Eyre, which I loved, but you know, that sense of damsels in distress and sort of deadly serious. And one of the things I think both these books have in common is there's a lot of wink in them. And it was really fun to write funny. It was fun to write about a girl and a whole set of characters who are outsiders. They're outside society. They don't really give a damn what people think about them. So that irreverence, which also I think is very much part of the fabric of San Francisco, was really fun to play with, and really fun to have a main character who doesn't care about being nice, but who ultimately actually is quite nice.
Yeah, she's kind. You know, I don't want to give anything away. You know, where the group ends up, you know, there is a sense of family. Tell us about the journey of family in this book.
Well, this moment. So you have Vera in the beginning of the book, who lives comfortably in a house with her foster family and ostensibly has a good life, but has everything but love. Mm-hmm. And when the quake hits, she loses even the house, and she is cast with her sister to figure out how to survive. But she's also she actually is allowed, I don't want to spoil things, but she goes to a place that she's normally not allowed to go. And she is suddenly responsible for a whole set of people who you would argue are outcast in normal society, but in a normal society of 1906, but who prove themselves to be worthy companions and actually the family she's always longed to have. And so much of what happened in the crisis in 1906, which I think is somewhat relevant to what we've been through, is there is a moment when there is a catastrophe like the pandemic, where because society essentially stops or has to rejigger, there is a moment where questions of what is fair, what are gross inequalities, suddenly come forward, and some people rise to the occasion. Some people decide they're going to reinvent things. And I'm interested in that. I'm interested in characters who are bent on reinvention, whatever that is. That doesn't mean that there's anybody wearing the white hat or the black hat. There's everyone, including Vera, is complicated and has his or her share of shadow. That's for sure. And that's what being human is.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, every character is reinventing themselves. And really, now that I think back over the different characters, and again, just the humor throughout. I also really enjoyed the places. I mean, we live in San Francisco, right? Many of us here in the Bay Area watching. And, there's, the ferry to Oakland, when you talk about after the quake, there was a sort of rush of who got onto the ferry to Oakland. And, you talked about the different city blocks that were burning. And, the fire reached to Van Ness, right? But didn't quite go over Van Ness. And it was just, and in Vendela's book too, we're in Seacliff, we're in China Beach, we're, taking Mooney to the Haight. And
Isn't that the joy of reading? And that's the joy of stories, is to take these magic carpet rides and go places you normally cannot go, behind the curtain, if you will, and to live there, not just in your head, but in your heart, but with all your senses. I mean, I think about in We Run the Tides, how smart Vendela is about where she sort of posits all the detail, from the Fiorucci shirts to all the things you mentioned in the opening. I mean, bang, you're right back in that moment in the city, with a certain class of girls. They know what is designer, what isn't designer. They know who lives in what house. I mean, they own the turf. So immediately, as a reader, you relax and you also lean forward because you're in the hands of a great storyteller. And that's what it's all about.
Yeah. Tell us about your process of translating research into fiction and what fiction can do that nonfiction cannot.
That's a big question, isn't it? I mean, nonfiction uses so many of the same tools of storytelling. When I research, I go way, 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 way down those rabbit holes, and I get so saturated with the time. My poor family, we're walking around San Francisco, and I'm like, well, that happened with the fire, and that didn't burn, and but at a point, I sort of know where my landmarks are and where those very specific things are that will bring the world to a reader. It will evoke an entire world. And I love engaging the senses. How did things smell? What was the sound of 28,000 buildings burning? Because of course there was the quake, and then there were 3 days of fire and 500 city blocks reduced to ash. What did that sound like? What was it like to have that much smoke? I mean, we've just lived through the fires of last year. What was it like to have that much smoke coming at you? And then I try to forget the research, and I just live with the characters and what moment to moment, what decisions are they making, and where do they mess up? I'm something that, in thinking about We Run the Tides and Vera, again, because you have young women, but forget that, you have people. It's always about wants and desires. It's always about, where desire leads you astray. And do you ever get the thing you want? And by the time you get it, is it the same? Is it what you actually want now? There's a great line in Vendela's book, we want what we want, what we want. I mean, that sense of now. Right. I've got to have it right now.
Yeah.
And, So I think that is one of the things, to go back to your question, that's one of the things that fiction gives us. It lets us enter a world completely and connect with our own lives. Like I really look for places where I leave things out so that it invites a reader to bring their reality, their experience onto the page.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What would you say to people who say, well, I just don't read fiction?
I used to say, oh, really? Because sometimes people will come up to you and say, I only read nonfiction. Mm-hmm. And there's kind of, a puffing of pride there. Like, I only read what's true. And, I'm older and crankier maybe. And now instead of saying, oh, engage in that, I say, I feel so sorry for you. Mm-hmm. Because I do. I mean, I think stories are such a gift, and they bring us back to those days around a campfire when we share the news of the day. And it's not just the telling of what happened, it's the sharing, soul to soul. It's that connection. And that's what fiction can do. And I think it should read as news of the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
We had a conversation at the festival just a couple of days ago with Orville Schell, who, well-known China expert. He'd written 17 nonfiction books and decided to write a novel. It took him 40 years. He was advised not to, you're a nonfiction guy. But after all these books about China, he felt like he couldn't, in nonfiction, get inside the human experience. And he had married a Chinese woman, sort of learned a lot more about what it felt like. And he just couldn't do it from the sort of externalized view of a nonfiction writer. So the novel's astonishing. But that's why he decided to take the leap into fiction. I think it really, it's consciousness. I mean, it's fiction. Yeah. You're in a mind.
Right.
Go ahead.
It quickly establishes the who and what. And then where it really lives and breathes is the how and why. And that's what I want to know. Isn't that what you want to know? I mean, I think I became a writer because I just am endlessly fascinated by what makes people tick, and it's an unsolvable pursuit. What makes people tick? Why do they do what they do? Yes,
the human question. Right. So speaking of, what we often think and do is extremely funny, and we stumble all over ourselves. And you use humor fabulously throughout the novel. I mean, Vera is hilarious, as is Rerun the Tides. So and Vendela did talk about her use of humor. Maybe we'll run Vendela's clip.
Oh, I'd love that.
Great. Yeah. And then you can comment on that. So can we get the second clip? There we go.
I have always wanted to write a funny novel. I've had experimented with humor in some books, but to a large extent, I haven't been able to incorporate humor. And a lot of my books have instances in that after which I can't incorporate humor anymore. In fact, one of my books was set in northern part of Scandinavia, Let the Northern Lights Erase Your Name, which was translated and published by Gyldendal. There was an incident that happened after which I was not allowed to be funny in the book. And I even had a piece of paper above my desk that said, like, you can't be funny, you can't be funny. And I really I actually have to say that I really owe a lot to Dave for encouraging me to write a book that was funny. He's always encouraging me to put my humor, especially in this book. And so I wanted to choose a setting and a palette, so to speak, that would allow me to incorporate humor. And the 80s and an all-girls school in the 1980s seemed just like ripe territory for that. So I will say the biggest challenge for me writing humor is making sure that it's not just something that's funny to you. And I do feel like one thing that's Dave and I have been married for 20 years now, and one thing I really appreciate is if I'm showing him my work and I print it out for him and I go into another room and I pretend I'm not listening, but I'm really listening to see if he's laughing. I kind of have like my ear against the wall. And I think that's always a sign. If someone's laughing and you hear them laughing, you know you're doing something right. And but it's hard. So it's hard to know when you're being funny, because sometimes I'll write something I like to wake up really early and write in the morning. Sometimes I'll write something at 5:30 in the morning that I think is really funny. And, but by 11 a.m., it's not as funny. And I just think I had too much coffee that morning or something. So I think you have to really test it out on people too. And it's like what comedians do. And I'm not saying I'm a comedian, but I'm saying comedians, like, they test their material and they see what makes people laugh and what other people respond to. And so I think that's something I try to do with writing. I'm a big believer in showing my work to a lot of people. And really, I think I started doing that because I wrote one book that I wrote the whole book. And I didn't show it to anyone. It's very protective. I felt like, no, I don't want anyone to see my work. And when I finally finished it, I read it. And it was so boring. It was so boring. I kept falling asleep. I was like, honestly, I was like drooling like on the manuscript. And I realized a very important lesson that if I thought it was boring, nobody else was going to think it was interesting. And so from that point on, I started being much more willing and even like really seeking out readers. I'm in a writers group right now with a number of Bay Area writers who've been really helpful to me. And I show them my work even 15 pages in, or I show Dave my work. Dave's always my first reader, and I show my work really early on now because I don't want to I don't want to write another really long, boring novel again and waste all that time.
Oh, that's great. It is really funny. I'm really glad Dave encouraged her to go for the funny bone, because in the funny bone, if done well, and she certainly does it well, you see the vulnerability in people. You do see the folly. You do see all the things that make us lovable, and on the other side, keep us apart. I mean, it's another way to build drama. Yeah, I'm so glad. I'm so glad. I'm so glad she went that route.
How about your own process of writing humor in Vera? It's just so funny. Consistently. I mean, I'm just going to give one thing away, okay, about a horse. The horse. I mean, you have to read the book.
People don't think the horse is funny.
It's funny. The horse didn't think it was funny. But I mean, just everywhere. And the way they talked, and the corruption, and the stuffed shirts, of these politicians. I mean, you poke fun at everyone, and you drop like famous names of San Francisco families that are like, in the line to get the food. And I mean, everywhere there's just, in the midst of this tragedy, you've got this, I guess, vulnerability, right? I mean, that's a time that people are showing things.
Well, everything is everything, right? So particularly in moments of duress or challenge, like we're all still living through, right? I mean, all the loss, all the sorrow, all the terrible divides between have and have-nots, between those with choice, those without choice, healthy and unhealthy, all those incredible complexities, right? In it, you also have moments of incredible humor, silliness. I mean, you have the full organ, right? All the time. So why not have all of that be part of the story? Why not have as much? I'm sure, I know you're this way. I mean, when we read, we want to have the fullest experience, right? I really believe that writing is the job of the writer is to give with both hands, to give as much. It's about generosity. So with that in mind, I really try, and God knows I fail most days at the desk. I really try to give as much of an experience on the page as I can.
Mm-hmm. And humor really opens the heart. When we see someone making fun of themselves, or just a situation that's funny, it's like we've all been there.
Right.
So it like equalizes and it humanizes.
Right. I mean, my first novel was about 3 generations of women in an Armenian American family. And the first chapter, as a reader, you walk through the Armenian genocide and you think, where could you possibly go from there that has any kind of humor? But you go 2 generations to America, and so much of the other side of that is among the survivors. It's women in a kitchen telling their stories, making fun of each other. In part, it's funny because they did survive something. So it's both sides of one coin. Like things are deadly serious in an earthquake. But on the other side, every day that you live is a day that you beat death and that you succeeded, and in that is something intrinsically joyous and funny.
Yeah, I want to play one last clip of Vendela, and she talks about literary community. I mean, she talked a little bit already about sharing her work with writing groups. But also, all 3 of us actually, you, me, and Vendela, have created literary organizations, in the Bay Area. I mean, Vendela co-founded The Believer. She was part of creating 826 Valencia. She's been involved in McSweeney's. I mean, hugely influential organizations. And of course, Carol co-founded Narrative Magazine, which is a phenomenal website. You were one of the first digital literary sites, and you can tell us maybe a little bit more. In fact, why don't you tell us now, just very briefly, a little bit about Narrative before we get to some sort of reflections on.
Well, you know what I would say, and I mean, your work with the festival that is so amazing and has become so quickly absolutely essential to not just the Bay Area, but one of the great festivals in the country and in the world. And hats off to you.
You're in it. Hats off to you. It's people like you who make anything good. So yeah.
Well, it's this idea of being a literary citizen, and what does that mean? And all 3 of us do this work because we believe in stories and in readers and writers, and connecting them. And what I would say about Narrative is, we started it 18 years ago. It was, it was the tumbleweed days of the web. And fast forward to today, we have a global readership of, the narrative library, thousands of stories and poems and essays, and all of it free. So not only is it read all over the world, and we publish several hundred writers a year, but a lot of schools, particularly in underserved communities, have found it. And Narrative in the schools is a whole other part of it that we could never have anticipated. But to be able to give literature, to put it in the hands of teachers and students, particularly in this year when everybody was studying in their houses online, it's just a joy. And I love editing my fellow writers and discovering new ones, and it just feels really exciting to me. I'm not sure I'll ever find the balance between writing. I don't know if Vendela's found the secret, or if you have, but
let's go to Vendela in this clip, because she talks exactly about that. So, and then we can get your response to that. So 3rd clip is queued up.
You asked who was an influence for me in terms of balancing writing and doing other things as well. And my first job, I was fortunate enough, my first job after college was working at the Paris Review, a literary magazine based in New York. And George was founded by George Plimpton, who is a writer, but also he had this idea of community of writers, and he organizes community of writers around the magazine. And that has always been such an inspiration to me, that as a writer, you don't have to just work alone. You can actually meet with other people and have a magazine that brings people together with words and help publish other people's words and bring out other people, unknown voices to a larger audience. So that was a huge inspiration for me. I totally agree. I really tried to keep myself honest by using a word count on the days I am writing. And like Dave, when I was editing The Believer, I would have certain days that were just, I would only edit The Believer on those days, and I wouldn't try to write on those days. So I really think that separation is really important. When I try to trick myself all the time into writing. When I was working on We Run the Tides, I would wake up really early, like 4 o'clock, 4:30, to try to write before anyone else woke up, before anyone else was emailing me, before the doorbell rang, before anything started happening. And I realized it wasn't enough just to tell myself I was waking up at 4:30 and I was going to spend 3 hours writing, because I would, you can trick yourself a lot into thinking you're working when you're not. When you're a writer, you can sit there and read other books that have nothing to do with your book and act like you're writing. And so to keep myself honest, I use a word count on the days that I'm writing and really try to write a certain amount of words a day, depending where I am in the novel, whether it's 500 words a day or 1,000 words a day. And it doesn't mean that I'm going to keep those words, but that's what I do to keep myself actually at the computer and not reading.
Self-deception.
Self-deception. It's all about lying. Back to the theme of lying and self-deception. It's all about tricking yourself.
Tricking yourself into thinking this is a rational way to live.
Exactly.
Oh, are you living a rational way to live and balancing? We have to go to questions in a minute, but I just want you to respond to that. First of
all, I have to say what I love about those clips is watching Dave watch her talk, and the respect between them, and also it's like he's hearing it for the first time, which is just so lovely. And it's funny because my Tom, who is also my first reader, he began at the Paris Review. So there's all these connections that are so, we'll have to have another conversation.
We're actually going to be able to have drinks.
Oh, great. Yes.
Soon. Oh my gosh. I know. In person.
Every writer I know has a way of tricking herself into getting words down on the page. And there are days when I'm so inside what I'm working on, just the days evaporate. I don't eat. I don't think about it. And then there are days when it is so hard that I have to, sometimes I just have to say to myself, okay, this day doesn't count. This doesn't count. I'm just going to play. And I have to turn off the editor side of me and just play. And setting those partitions, setting those things where, okay, narrative, I have to put off to the side, and, this is writing time. Often it's late at night, early in the morning to when things are still. My kids are grown now, but, especially those years when they were young, it was just, my daughter said to me the other day that she went to sleep every night to the sound of me typing. Mm. And I think about that, that got her down to sleep, madly. The crazy woman in the room next door typing. There you go.
That's a great image. Yeah. So let's take some questions. The audience, I think a lot have come in. Brooke, can you jump in with some?
I can. There are some really great ones. Lots about your book specifically, Carol. So I thought I'd start with one of those. Jeffrey says, a natural disaster opens a crack into one's worldview. And in that new light, long established truths can be reevaluated and reconciled. What motivated you to look at this century-old upheaval through the eyes of a young woman navigating between socially appropriate and socially inappropriate worlds?
Well, I think that was beautiful.
Beautiful question.
I think you gave the best answer I could possibly give. I'm always looking for those dramatic moments when everything, forgive me, shifts. But when politics meets something societal, meets characters who in some way are in crisis and have to change, whatever that change is. So the earthquake seemed like a perfect metaphor for disruption in society, and particularly that quake and fire because of the political overtones. And this sense, one of the main characters in the book is this servant, Tan, who is an incredibly elegant, accomplished chef, butler, whatever, major domo, good father, which is something incredibly exotic to a fatherless girl like Vera. But he's also a Chinese man in 1906, a servant, and must live in a basement on a dirt floor with broken furniture and a chamber pot, while upstairs he is polishing the silver. And that kind of gross inequality was both. If I was going to write Tan as a character, I wanted to show him in his complexity, in his nuance, and he grows and changes in the book. And he and Vera start out really as rivals, and moment to moment prove to each other that actually, in some ways, they are the closest of family. And that's the kind of thing that something dramatic like a quake, even though it's set years ago. I mean, as we've been saying all night, humans haven't changed. Humans haven't been reinvented. So many of the things that happened long ago are still happening. I mean, it's what we're talking about all the time.
I'm so glad you brought up Tan, because there was a couple of questions about him, and he's clearly such a compelling character in the novel. And so I'm going to combine these two questions. One is just, where did Tan come from for you? What inspired that kind of Chinese character for you? And then, about the entrepreneurship, really the intersection of entrepreneurship between Tan and Vera, and how they lean into each other to survive. So could you speak to both those questions?
Well, it's also a book about scrappy characters. And those were the characters most interesting to me then and now, who aren't given the keys to the kingdom, but have to in some way find them. And if not find them, they make the keys, they fashion them for themselves. And both Vera and Tan in some ways are equals in terms of capability, though they don't know that at the beginning, but perhaps they suspect that about each other, and it's what creates the rivalry. But after the crisis, it becomes really clear who the question of who you can count on becomes not just sort of a casual question. It becomes, really essential moment to moment. And they are the people they can survive, they can count on, and a few others too. And in that they become family. And it was important to me in terms of writing Tan to give him that fullness, to give him dimension that. And I have to say, he's the character who surprised me the most in the writing. He kept growing. He kept challenging me. He kept showing me sides of himself that I had to, I at least was smart enough to know I had to follow. And that's part of the joy. I don't always, I vaguely know where I'm going to end, but I have no idea how I'm going to get there. And I let the characters in the story just guide me.
Another question that speaks to intersections, Carol, is this thing that I know other people have talked about, because you and I talked about it before, which is there's this way in which Vera feels very contemporary and has contemporary struggles, and yet she's this character who, you're writing about her in 1906. And so how did you manage to do that? And were you thinking specifically about making her relatable to modern audiences in that way?
Well, there are two Veras. There's Vera, the character, and then there's Vera, the much older narrator, who is over 100 years of age. So I imagined her telling this tale in the early 90s. So that was important to me, to both have the distance and the wisdom, and to have the modulation between these two characters, the young girl and the crone. And what is the Vera who's actually telling the tale is way at the end of her life. So how she tells it with a kind of quickness, and she tells it leaving out all the parts that she's not really interested in anymore. And that was a challenge, and it was fun, but it also gave me the ability to tell it in a more modern way, because her vernacular spans 100 years. So there's moments when she sounds like she's in 1906, and certainly the dialogue does at times, but she's also fairly modern.
Right. That's a great device. Elaine asked if you were living here in San Francisco during the 1989 Loma Prieta quake, and did this affect you and the writing of this novel?
Yeah, I was. It sure did. We were living in a flat in the Haight, and our landlady was living below us, and she was 8.5 months pregnant. And I remember when, and it was this Victorian house on a hill near Buena Vista Park, and the whole house groaned. I mean, that's where I really got it. I could hear the house groan, and I could see the waves in the floor. And as soon as we knew, we were okay, we ran downstairs to check on her, and she had been under the house when it happened. And when we got out to the front steps, she was sitting on the steps with a bucket of ice cream between her knees, just eating ice cream. Just, what we do in these moments, it's like, okay, I made it, but we had friends living in the marina whose house was just devastated, and they had to come live with us. So very much that was for all of us who lived through that. That was amazing, and I'm sure you haven't forgotten those who've lived through it. All the aftershocks for days, where you're constantly braced.
Goodness. Maybe this can be our final question, unless you have one final one, Cherilyn.
One more, we're done. Yeah.
Okay, fabulous. So I think this is just an interesting question that, if Vendela was here, perhaps both of you would have answered this differently. And I know you've lived here a long time, Carol, and you've raised your daughters here. And so it asks this question about how can we keep San Francisco an epicenter for young people's coming of age and independence with, it's a big question, so if you can answer it quickly, with inequality, racism, and gender-based violence putting roadblocks in people's paths. And perhaps that's not unique to San Francisco.
Well, I think we have to be allies. We have to be citizens. We have to keep telling the stories to bring awareness forward. We can't be passive. We can love this city and recognize that it is in crisis, and that all the gifts that San Francisco has in terms of light and spark and entrepreneurship, it has an equal amount of shadow, and we got to keep shining the light on the shadow too.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, I'm just thinking about how Vendela explores that question in Rerun the Tides. It's about San Francisco on the cusp of the tech age. And there's definitely experiences of inequality and certainly class that she explores a little bit. It's like the book is right on the edge of the big inequality.
Well, one of the things that I thought was so beautiful in Vendela's book is that sense that you are your own vessel, and how you conduct yourself in the world is really up to you. And that was something I took from that book that I thought was so powerful, whether you're a teenage girl or, a full-grown adult. It's sort of how you move through the world, no matter what's coming at you, determines in some regard your fate, but more importantly, how your relationship with yourself and your relationship with the world. And isn't that what we're saying here with all the trouble in the world. It's up to each of us.
Yeah, yeah. And you talked earlier about how sort of the time then of the 1906 quake and the relationship with the time now. And, you didn't know a pandemic was coming, obviously, when you wrote about, a big disaster. But you said that it is in times of disaster and crisis when we really see what people are made of. And, so you have this teenage girl who becomes so powerful, more so than many of these people who are, the supposed leaders and so on. And she maneuvers amazingly. So I think, just discovering in these times as something fiction can, I think, really show us, of just sort of taking us through journeys of these difficult times. But what you just described about Vendela's book, in terms of what it leaves us with, what would you want to leave us with from Vera, from having read this book?
I think the same thing, that catastrophe for many is an opportunity for some, and it's an opportunity to show up, and to show up in new ways, to surprise yourself, and to choose in life. I mean, I think it's a conversation we're all having right now. What are we going to take from our lives during this pandemic forward? What did you learn going forward? And one of the things about Vera is at the end, I mean, there's a line I'm going to bastardize my own line here, but she says, I think in the end, I love most the contradictions, the parts of us that are contradictory and therefore most human. And I think that's what I'd want to leave you with.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Carol. And thank you, Vendela. We really,
Vendela, my friend.
Yeah, we wish you get better very soon. And thank you for your spirit and all that you expressed in those video clips. We were really thankful to have them. And let me turn it back over to Brooke. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Carol and Cherilyn. What a great conversation.